Welcome, and thank you for joining the Dana Thomas House Foundation Education Committee's webinar, Across the Street and Around the Corner, zooming in on Susan Lawrence Dana's neighbors. This evening, we will be taking you on a journey, a then and now look at what you would have seen in the neighborhood from as far back as 1854. We will zoom in on the families on Lawrence and 4th Streets in 1902, the year Frank Lloyd Wright began the major construction on Susan's home. You will hear about what Springfield was like in that time, meeting a doctor, several lawyers and judges, artists and educators, and many business owners who all influenced Springfield. We will visit the State Fair of 1902, see pictures of Springfield throughout time, and show then and now photos of many sites. You will also hear about a tragedy in 1916 that changed many things in our neighborhood. We have tried to be as accurate as possible. Sometimes names and dates have conflicting information in old records. We have located old photos and new, but many of the buildings and houses have been torn down. We welcome any corrections as well as new information. So, let's get rolling. To help you with the exact location of the neighborhood, let's take a look at what is there now. Here is the Dana Thomas house today, at the corner of 4th and Lawrence. The next two slides show maps of the 3 houses on Lawrence that will be discussed. These maps are also on our website. Here is a photo taken from the Dana Thomas house across the street to the 3 houses that the foundation now owns. 308 East Lawrence, 306 East Lawrence, and 302 East Lawrence, now the office of the Dana Thomas House Foundation. A few years ago, the Dana Thomas House Foundation acquired these 3 properties, plus 2 on 4th Street and 1 on 3rd. We wanted to make sure the neighborhood was sustained and added to the experience of visitors coming to the Dana Thomas House. Through donations and fundraising, we have paid off the mortgage and have moved our foundation office into the property at 302 East Lawrence.
But let's now imagine it is June 1902. The residents along Lawrence and 4th Streets are waking up and preparing for the day. The women are tending to the children. Some of the children are gathering up their school books and leaving their houses for the last few weeks of the school year. The men are stepping out their doors, headed to their various workplaces. Maybe Susan Lawrence Dana watched out the window of her Italianate-style house at the activity. Across the street on Lawrence, she could have seen Dr. John King, age 49, leave his large Victorian-era home, an example of the Italianate style. And you will notice the street name is Wright. We will explain the changes made to street names later in the program. King is headed to his office above Dillard Drugstore downtown. We have also found a picture of the inside of the store. And later in the year, Susan could have seen a new resident move into the King home, T.W. Kerwin, and notice the changes he made to the house. This is the house as seen from the side by the railroad tracks. Now look back to the front of the house and look at the home on the left. This was the home of 34-year-old Rufus Lavely, who Susan may have seen leaving his house in the best new suit to head downtown to unlock his new store, Lavely and Saunders Men's Hats and Furnishings, at 513 East Washington. His store stood along this block of Washington, and a later photo shows the store sign. Notice the dots in the sign, which would have been lights. The number of cars helps identify that this is a much later picture than 1902. This store became the Springfield dry goods store in 1953. Now, maybe Susan looked towards 4th and Lawrence and saw several friends making their way downtown. Matthias Bartle, who lived on the corner, would be heading to his boot and shoe store at 622 East Adams. And others who lived in the 800 block of 4th would be headed to their own shops. George Day to his wallpaper and paint store at 421 East Adams. This is known as the Lanphier building that was built around 1880 and is in the same block as Cafe Moxo. Gus Lockman to his jeweler store and optician office at 210 South 6th Street, a 3-story building with checkerboard stone trim. We found a receipt showing that Susan Lawrence Dana purchased from this store on several occasions. A silver bowl for $29, a silver basket for $16, a bread and a roll tray. Overacre would be going to his china and glassware store at 509 East Washington. James Parkerson to his produce store at 412 East Monroe. It is the building with the pink awning, House of Gifts. John Rippon, at the age of 74, still ran his Excelsior foundry and machine shop at 9th and Adams. And Francis Ide, age 31, had taken over his father's engine manufacturing company at 301 North 5th. Albert L. Ide had started the company that manufactured the Ideal engine, which he named after himself, Ide and Al, Ideal. These engines were sold all over the world. Also passing by Susan's home could have been Lucius Castle, the very popular teacher and now principal at the high school, the only high school for many years. He would be preparing for graduation exercises for the 72 graduates in 1902. Called the high school, or Springfield High School, sometimes Central High School, there were 3 times up to 1917 that new buildings were constructed. The first one in 1865 at 4th and Madison. The second in 1896, located in the block between Adams, College, Washington, and Passfield, called Central High School, which you see in this picture. And notice the horse and buggy in front of it. And then we have our current Springfield High School, built in 1917 on Lewis Street. Other high schools came later. Feitchen's opened in 1929 and was replaced in 1967 by Southeast High School. And Lanphier opened in 1937. Another educator living on 4th Street in 1902 was Clara Wallace, a 6th and 7th grade teacher at McClernand School, who would be ready to face students for the day. Here is McClernand School today. Possibly some of the neighborhood children walked with the principal or teacher to their own schools, or headed north on 4th to the Betty Stewart Institute. Today, it is next to the bank and is used as a reception hall. 2 lawyers might pass by Susan's home, and she would easily recognize them, as they both served as pallbearers at her father's funeral in 1901. Lawyer Christopher Columbus Brown, 63, on his way to his office at 309 South 6th, and Judge William Gross, age 68, whose office was in the Marine Bank building on 6th and Washington. William J. Conkling, 75, another lawyer, could have been walking with his son, William H. Conkling, who was 44 years old, as they lived next door to each other on 4th Street. Young William served as assistant postmaster. Charles Lindbergh stayed at William H. Conkling's house in 1926, as seen in this picture of today. Lindbergh met Conkling when he landed a plane many times in Springfield to deliver mail on his route from St. Louis to Chicago. He and Conkling became friends. In 1927, Lindbergh returned for the renaming of the landing field from the Conkling Field to the Lindbergh Field. This was just a few months before Lindbergh made his famed transatlantic flight in 1927. Another resident in the 800 block of 4th Street was George Bates, the secretary of the Illinois Watch Company and member of the school board. He would probably have hopped on the trolley to go north of town to the business out on North Grand. So these are the men who lived in what we now call Aristocracy Hill. Chances are some of the men walked down 4th past the governor's mansion. Susan herself would have visited the governor's mansion. We know that she was very good friends with several governors, in particular, Governor Charles Deneen, who would become governor in 1905. Susan was friends with his wife, Bina. And there are many articles about Susan hosting the Deneens at her home or serving as a hostess for Mrs. Deneen at parties at the mansion. And here is the governor's mansion today. Across the street from the governor's mansion, the entire block had once been the home of the former governor Joel Madison, who had been governor in 1852. When he lived in the governor's mansion, he called it, quote, dull and unfashionable. So he built his own home in 1856 in view of the governor's mansion that rivaled the governor's mansion. His home burned down in 1873. So our men would be walking along the street and would have passed the Betty Stewart Institute. And if Christopher Columbus Brown took this route, he would no doubt remember his first wife, Betty, who had died in 1869. And in her honor, he had started the Institute the following year in their former home. The Institute was a boarding school and day school for over 70 years. We know that Susan Lawrence Dana attended for a couple years. Betty had been the daughter of John Todd Stewart, Lincoln's law partner, and his house was also on 4th across from the governor's mansion, where in 1902 Harris Hickox now lived. This house is the Italianate style with bracketed cornices and window hoods that are features similar to Lincoln's home. The men would have walked by the house of Harry Loper, who owned a restaurant downtown on 5th Street that was later demolished in the 1908 race riot. During the riot, 2 African-American men had been accused of murders and put in jail. The sheriff wanted them taken out of the jail before a white mob stormed the facility. He called upon Loper, who was one of only a few in the city who owned a car. Loper drove his car behind the jail. While the sheriff distracted the crowd with a false fire alarm, the prisoners quickly slipped into Loper's car and he drove them to the McLean County Jail. Today, here's what we see across from the governor's mansion, the Mansion View Hotel and Lukanen's restaurant. And we can still see this house that is being restored. It was the home of J.S. Condell. He had been living in this house since 1852 when he bought it and moved it from its original location at 5th and Monroe. In 1902, he was 84 years old and had once owned a successful dry goods store downtown. Abraham Lincoln and Mary shopped there, and it was reported that Mary would look at material for a dress and tell Mr. Condell that she would just have to wait until Mr. Lincoln was successful in a certain case before she could make a purchase. The men headed to shops close to each other as seen in this map. We can guess at what they may have been discussing. Maybe the word that Susan Lawrence Dana would be starting a major construction project in September, and they would reach downtown. Here is a picture of downtown. Notice the trolley lines overhead. The men may have discussed the proposal to remove the overhead lines by the time of the state fair, which was scheduled to open at the end of September. And no doubt, they also talked about their work in decorating their storefronts for the annual carnival held in downtown Springfield during Fair Week. This year in 1902, the downtown arches were planned to be strung with red, white, and blue lights. The arches stood on the four corners of the square. And although there are some accounts saying these had once been at the 1893 Chicago World's Fair and brought here, that is incorrect. Actually, the businessmen of Springfield pooled their money and hired a firm in Ohio to construct the arches. But what did come from the 1893 Chicago World's Fair, also called the Columbian Exposition, was a building called the Dome Building, with its massive glass dome. It had been dismantled and reconstructed here in Springfield on the fairgrounds. In 1917, the wooden beams caught fire and the entire dome crashed to the ground. Bricks from the Dome Building were used in the construction of the Arts and Crafts Building at the State Fairgrounds. The men have now arrived at their businesses to begin work.
While the men headed to work, their wives pursued their own interests. Several would be headed to Susan's house for various activities. We know Mrs. Lucius Castle, whose first name was Timothy, was a member of the Springfield Women's Club, and Susan often hosted the group. Ironically, Mrs. Castle had presented a program at Susan's home in 1895 on how to hang a picture. Ironic, because after Wright designed Susan's new home, no pictures were hung on the walls. Elizabeth Ide, Christopher Columbus Brown's daughter and Frances Ide's wife, was also active in the Women's Club. She, Timothy Castle, and Susan were also members of the Daughters of the American Revolution, and Susan served as an officer. Mrs. Ide lived to be 105. Mrs. Lee Day had been Susan's friend since childhood, and when they attended the Betty Institute together, she often took her children to Susan's to take pictures for the scrapbook that she compiled. In this first slide, there is writing in the corner with the caption, "Pictures taken and colored by Susan Dana." From the pictures, it is obvious that the Dana Thomas house served as a backdrop for photos. Lee Day added artistic flares to the pages. Some of the pages include small fold-out sections. A few years later, in 1907, Lee Day hosted a huge party at the Illini Country Club, welcoming Susan home from a 6-month trip abroad. Several mothers could have attended Susan's Wednesday afternoon teas or taken their children to Susan's for one of her children's parties. Mrs. Catherine Bartle, with her 5 children, often visited Susan. In fact, in 1906, when Catherine died, Susan often let 3-year-old Gertrude run up and down the stairs at her house, and on her travels, Susan brought each Bartle child a rosary.
So that is what could have been happening in the summer of 1902, but what was Springfield really like then? In 1902, the city's population was around 38,000. There were many small grocery shops, one being the Connolly grocery shop at 417 Monroe, advertising dressed turkeys for sale, and the Bunn wholesale grocers at 10th and Adams. In the second slide, you see that smoke is coming from the side of the building. It is due to a fire that started upstairs. It was reported to have roasted numerous bags of peanuts and carloads of coffee beans. Just imagine the amazing aroma that wafted throughout Springfield. Streets across town were being paved. Lawrence Street was paved around 1904. Notice the number of men involved in the work. The Dana Thomas house can clearly be seen on the left. This is looking down Lawrence eastward, and you can see a house on the corner across 4th. Horse-drawn carriages and delivery vans would have been seen. Streets at this time were either brick or unpaved, and horses, of course, would make streets quite messy. People also got around on an electrified trolley car system that Susan and her neighbors may have ridden, as they could go 1 block to 5th Street to the east or 2 blocks to 2nd Street to the west and hop on the car for their journey. The interurban, with service to other cities, would not have started yet, but came only 2 years later in 1904. The train system on 3rd Street, with its tracks behind the Dana Thomas House, is shown on a map as early as 1854, long before Susan was born. Some people own cars, as we heard about Harry Loper, but a record from 1909 lists only 125 cars in the entire city. Dr. John King may have owned a car when he lived on Lawrence. We know from later articles that he owned several. The downtown arches stood on all four corners of the square, the old state capitol as we know it today. The arches were erected in 1899 in preparation for the Illinois State Fair parade and festivities. They reportedly added to part of Springfield's charm. However, later in 1920, William Conklin said the arches had definitely served their purpose and should be demolished. All of Springfield was in agreement. Ironically, 112 years later, in 2011, designers for the arches at Springfield's Southwind Park looked to the 1900 arches for inspiration. Streets still had hitching posts of a horse's head. Notice the one on the right in this picture, while trolley lines ran through the streets. Overhead wires provided the electricity for the trolleys. September of 1902 was also when construction began on Susan Lawrence Dana's new home on Lawrence Avenue. Across town, other construction was underway. The Carnegie Library construction at 7th and Capitol also began in 1902. The new library, with its classical revival architecture, was dedicated in 1904, the same year Susan's home was completed. This library was torn down in 1974. Notice the 6 columns. The columns from the Carnegie Library now stand in the courtyard of the horticultural area in Washington Park. Notice there are only 5. Sadly, one broke when being removed from the building. The new modern library was then built at the same location of 7th and Capitol. What a stark contrast between the Carnegie classical revival architecture with that of Frank Lloyd Wright's prairie design, located just blocks from one another. Yes, a lot was happening in 1902.
But now let's go back in time. An 1854 map shows us several things. And you're probably hearing the train going down 3rd Street at this moment. That is what Susan heard a lot, as well as the people who lived in this neighborhood. But at the current site of the Dana Thomas House in 1854, there was a house owned by Daniel Ruckel. Ruckel and his brother Jacob were furniture makers. They came to Sangamo Town near Springfield in the 1840s, ran a sawmill, and built cabinets. They moved into Springfield in 1843 and added upholstery and paper hangings to their business. And across the railroad tracks on 3rd Street, Peleg C. Kennedy owned land extending south all along 3rd Street next to the railroad tracks. He had opened the first drugstore in Springfield around 1832 and ran it until 1866. Lincoln was often a customer. Peleg was the president of the Springfield Board of Trustees before Springfield was given a charter, and was one of the committee members to receive Lincoln's remains in 1865. We know from other maps that in 1864, the south side of the street from the railroad tracks would have been owned by a dentist, Dr. French, who built a house in 1869. Runa Lawrence, 31, either built a new house or he might have remodeled the old Ruckel house in 1868, moving in with his wife, Mary Agnes, and 6-year-old Susan, called Susie. The house faced 4th Street. When Susan remodeled the home in 1902, Wright placed the front door facing Lawrence. For many years, not much would have been seen along Lawrence. Dr. King, who we mentioned earlier, was living at 302 East Lawrence by 1889. But Lawrence wasn't actually the name of the street until 1898. In early days, the street was called Douglas, and then changed to Wright, and then to Lawrence. It was renamed after Susan's father, Runa Lawrence, who had been mayor of Springfield and president of the school board. It is ironic that the original name of the street would turn out to be the same name of the architect, Frank Lloyd Wright, who Susan hired to redesign her father's home. The trolley line, as seen in the 1898 map, traversed the city, and the red dot is the Dana Thomas house. The yellow lines show the trolley lines that were close by.
1904 to 1916. Susan Lawrence Dana's new house was finished in 1904. For 2 years, her neighbors must have heard pounding and banging at the site, watching this very different house being built. We can imagine that the neighbors, delivery vans, and others had to maneuver around construction items. And for those still living in the neighborhood, they must have seen people coming and going from the house as Susan hosted large parties. The 3 houses at 302, 306, and 308 East Lawrence saw a succession of residents. In 1904, Walter Eden, a 40-year-old attorney for the Sangamon County Abstract Company, was getting ready to move out of 308 East Lawrence, where he had lived for a short time. His father was John Rice Eden, who had served as a U.S. representative from Illinois from 1863 to 1865 and had run for governor in 1868, losing to John Palmer. Walter Eden went on to make a name for himself after he moved to California in 1907 and was later elected to 2 terms in the California Senate. Lansing Tiffany moved into 308 until 1909. He had a veterinarian office across from the Leland Hotel, owned race horses, and was named the state veterinarian in around 1910. He patented medicine for horses and also owned the Springfield Conservatory of Music, which was on Spring Street. His wife Mary was the piano teacher and director. The conservatory offered piano, voice, violin, harmony, and even French and German lessons. Today, this is where the Capitol complex is located. Quoting from this letter written on November 1st, 1888, Lansing introduced himself to Springfield and wrote, "Having located in this city in the practice of veterinary medicine and surgery, I respectfully tender my professional services to the public. In connection with my practice, I have established a veterinarium, an infirmary for the treatment of diseased and disabled animals, which is supplied with the latest appliances for the successful practice of the veterinary science, both medical and surgical. Wonderful advancement is being made in veterinary science, and it will always be my aim to keep pace with it when, by attending closely to my practice, and in all instances make my charges reasonable, I hope to merit the confidence and patronage of the public." It was signed Dr. L.S. Tiffany, V.S., grad of Ontario Vet College, and included the fact that he was assistant state veterinarian. At 302, Edward Cornelius Dwyer lived from 1905 to 1908, and he died in the house. His son-in-law, Fred Roth, then moved in. Roth was a chemist at Stewart Broadwell Drugstore at 5th and Washington. Drugstore opened in the 1830s. He later opened his own drugstore, Roth Drugstore, at 6th and Capitol.
Then, tragedy struck the 300 block of Lawrence. To better understand this story, it is important to know about who was living in these 3 houses on Lawrence at that time. At 302 lived the Roth family. At 306 lived the Henry Harris family. He was a bookseller for the American Sales Book Company located in the downtown Ferguson building, which has been in the news lately. And at 308, Mrs. Etna Atwood was finishing the construction of a 3-story flat, already living in part of the building. On October 3rd, 1916, fire broke out in the basement of Mrs. Atwood's flat. The newspaper headline the next day read, "Occupants of doomed structures flee in night clothes as flames spread with incredible rapidity." The paper reported that Mrs. Atwood woke up to flames and her hair and eyebrows were singed. A rapid breeze caused the flames to consume her home and was spreading to other homes on Lawrence, on 4th, and even on 3rd. A call was made to send the fire trucks, and they left from the firehouse that really wasn't far away. As flames spread, firemen were delayed due to the telephone operator mistakenly reporting that the fire was at 4th and Monroe instead of 4th and Lawrence. Residents in the 200 block came out. The men started a bucket brigade to try to keep flames from spreading to their homes, while at the same time putting out flames on 3rd Street. It was reported that Mrs. Atwood had to be pulled out of the window by Mrs. Harris, who had escaped from her home. In a subsequent article, Mrs. Harris said she only helped Mrs. Atwood off the porch. The glare could be seen all over the city. At Susan Lawrence Dana's home, the heat from the fire broke out plate glass windows. It was reported later that the damage to her home was $100, so it wouldn't have been the art glass windows that broke. The day after the fire, it is estimated that 10,000 people walked by the site. An investigation into the cause of the fire was then begun. Nothing was left on Lawrence, and the 2 houses on 4th were lost. Susan's home now faced an area of devastation. This fire was a turning point for the area. The entire block of 300 remained vacant for almost a decade until new houses were built in 1925, 1926, and 1930. During that time, the new houses that were being built were much different from the 2-story structures that had been there. Now, bungalows became more common, with new types of architecture emerging. New neighbors also moved in and continued to impact Springfield. Let's hear about a few of them.
In the 1930s, James Weber moved into 302 East Lawrence. He was a druggist and opened his store, the Illinois Drug Company, in 1923 at the corner of 4th and Washington inside the Illinois Hotel. It had a soda fountain, cigar stand, and candy stand. In February 1932, 7 doctors and 7 druggists were accused of selling whiskey during Prohibition. Was he one? We are not sure. But we do know in 1935, his store was robbed at gunpoint, and the robber forced him and his son to stand in the back of the store while the robber took money from the cash register and ran out of the store, where he climbed into a running car driven by his cohort, and they sped off. And here's a picture of the window display. In 1933, at 308 East Lawrence, the engineer at the Orpheum Theater lived. His name was Clarence Clay. The Orpheum Theater cost $2 million to build in 1927. Today, it would cost $29 million. And by 1946, Nathaniel Curran had moved into 308 East Lawrence. He had graduated from Springfield High School in 1924 and was the captain of the football team. He worked for the Department of Highways and published articles in the Illinois Highway Bulletin. His great-grandfather had been Lincoln's commanding officer in the Black Hawk War. His grandfather had come to Springfield in 1840. The town of Curran is named after his grandfather. And Nathaniel Curran lived in this house until at least 1956.
Another person we need to mention is Eva McDonald, who lived at 230 East Lawrence next to the railroad tracks. Eva boarded people, and cooked meals. Susan often came to eat. When Susan was still traveling, she would bring home recipes from chefs at places where she had eaten, and Eva fixed the meals. Across the street was the Queen Anne style cottage where Susan lived starting in the late 1920s. This had once been on the Lawrence property and was moved during the Reconstruction. Susan Lawrence Dana lived a lavish life, but gave much to the people in the area and to the city. She worked on women's rights, lobbied at the Capitol for education, and women's suffrage.
Today, the foundation owns properties that can be seen here in yellow. 3 houses on Lawrence, 1 house on 3rd, and 2 vacant lots on 4th. We have rented out 2 of the houses, used 1 for the foundation office, and have cleaned up the area. We feel that Susan Lawrence Dana would appreciate the efforts that have gone into making her home and her neighborhood something to be proud of. At this time, we would like to thank the members of our Education Committee who helped put this webinar together. We would also like to thank Curtis Mann and Stephanie Martin at the Sangamon Valley Collection for assisting us with our research, and the Sangamon County Historical Society. We encourage you to visit our website. There you can actually join the foundation and see more about the Dana Thomas House. Also, take a moment to like us on Facebook. We welcome any donations you would like to make for our ongoing work and for this webinar. To do so, go to the website or just send a check to Dana Thomas House Foundation, P.O. Box 7123, Springfield, Illinois 62791. On behalf of the Dana Thomas House Foundation, we thank you for joining us